The universe, with all its heavenly bodies, has been a mystery to man since the beginning of time. Millions of stars and galaxies reach beyond the limit of what he can now see.
6.120.
But he is increasingly exploring the space environment, gaining new knowledge and understanding. His dreams of landing on the moon are nearing reality. He has learned to maneuver spacecraft in orbit. He overcame the difficulty of working in space. He orbited highly developed satellites to gain additional knowledge of the sun, moon, and space. He designed and constructed new facilities for the lunar mission. And he prepared the Apollo Saturn V rocket, which will launch men on their historic journey to the moon. The broad range of scientific programs conducted by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration is giving man answers to satisfy his quest for knowledge of the universe. These programs are developed and managed by NASA Research and Spaceflight Centers located throughout the United States. The centers, working in conjunction with universities, research laboratories, and the aerospace industry, formulate experiments. They prepared the spacecraft, the astronauts, and the launch vehicles, which will carry man farther in his exploration of space. Most of NASA's vehicles are launched from the John F. Kennedy Space Center. The skills of 23,000 persons are employed at the center to ensure the successful launch of each NASA vehicle. Most of these workers are employed by contractors who, under NASA management, operate the vast Space Center and inspect and assemble launch vehicles and spacecraft. The NASA management team, headed by Center Director Dr. Kurt Davis, supervises operations and directs the contractors. For example, the countdowns for manned and unmanned launches are conducted by closely knit NASA industry launch teams. This was the scene in the control center for the Apollo Saturn I vehicle. This rocket was the 11th Saturn constructed under the direction of the Marshall Space Flight Center. It was more powerful than previous Saturns and the largest rocket launched by NASA. The spacecraft topping this 22-story high vehicle was an unmanned Apollo. Weighing 18 tons, Apollo was developed under the direction of the Manned Spaceflight Center. Inside the Launch Control Center, a team of 300 manned the consoles, recorders, and computers for the launch. Throughout the countdown, these electronic instruments check functional systems of the vehicle several times each second. At T-3 minutes, the launch director gave the go-ahead, and the automated computer system took over the countdown.
Minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Engines of the first stage operated flawlessly, generating 1,600,000 pounds of thrust to boost the 640-ton vehicle into space. At an altitude of 40 miles, the first stage engines cut off. Then, the first stage separated from the vehicle. The single engine of the second stage ignited to propel itself and the spacecraft 300 miles above the Earth. The Apollo was not placed into orbit. Instead, its propulsion unit was used to ram it back into the atmosphere at lunar re-entry speed of 18,000 miles per hour to test the heat shield. 5,000 miles downrange from Cape Kennedy, the Navy carrier Boxer was on station for recovery. The blackened heat shield gave evidence of the searing 4,000-degree heat of re-entry. Inspection of the Apollo revealed that the spacecraft designed to carry 3 men had passed another critical test. In the following months, another spacecraft and 2 Saturn vehicles were flight tested. An unusual airplane called the Pregnant Guppy delivers Apollo spacecraft to the Kennedy Space Center. In the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, the Apollo undergoes an extensive series of tests. Astronauts take part in many tests of the spacecraft, including those in an altitude chamber. Tests conducted in the airless chamber simulate the conditions of space. Nearby, in the astronaut training facility, space flights are rehearsed in a mission simulator. The simulator contains all of the instruments and equipment of an Apollo spacecraft. The astronauts practice Earth orbital missions here. They can also take a simulated trip to the moon and return. Nearly every detail of flight, with the exception of weightlessness, can be duplicated. While the Apollo Saturn system was being tested, NASA's Gemini program was successfully completed. 2 unmanned and 10 manned Gemini spacecraft were launched from Complex 19 at the Kennedy Space Center in 1965 and 1966. The most difficult flights were those Gemini missions which required the simultaneous countdown of 2 launch vehicles. The Gemini Titan at one complex and an Atlas Agena at another. Agena was first placed in orbit. About 100 minutes later, as it completed 1 orbit of the Earth and passed over Cape Kennedy, the Gemini spacecraft was launched to chase the Agena target vehicle. The first successful rendezvous and docking with the target vehicle was accomplished in March 1966 by Gemini 8 astronauts Armstrong and Scott. However, the mission was cut short when their spacecraft began to roll violently. The astronauts were forced to use most of their fuel to bring the spacecraft under control. Gemini 8 landed in the Pacific Ocean within 5 miles of the recovery ship. The spacecraft and crew were quickly recovered and welcomed aboard the USS Leonard F. Mason. In the next flight, Gemini 9 astronauts Stafford and Cernan rendezvoused with a target adapter unit. Docking could not be accomplished because a shroud covering the adapter failed to release properly. On their second day, astronaut Cernan walked in space for 2 hours and 9 minutes, setting a new record for extravehicular activity. Gemini 10 astronauts, Young and Collins, were the first to use the Agena vehicle's propulsion system to change orbit. They used the Agena to propel the Gemini spacecraft to an altitude of 450 miles. Later, they rendezvoused with an Agena which had been launched in March, 4 months before their flight. Several space firsts were achieved during the Gemini 11 mission. Astronauts Conrad and Gordon docked with the Agena and then used its engines to climb to a record altitude of 850 miles. The spectacular view from that height prompted Conrad to confirm the age-old theory of Christopher Columbus.
Okay, everything's go up here and the world is round. You got a good view? I mean, it's spectacular.
The following day, Gordon became the first astronaut to work in space. The simple task of attaching a 100-foot tether to the Agena became a laborious job in the space environment.
Take time. How you doing? Tired, Pete. All right, just rest. Yeah, you got plenty of time. Both cameras are running. How you doing? Oh, I'm here. Huh? I'm here, I guess. Sure are. Ride him, cowboy.
The tether was used in an experiment to stabilize the two spacecraft. Some of the problems of working in space were solved during the Gemini 12 flight of astronauts Lovell and Aldrin. Using a telescoping handrail, foot restraints, and adjustable body tethers, Aldrin was able to perform tasks without difficulty. They were welcomed back by Space Center workers as NASA's Gemini program came to a successful conclusion. In all, 16 Gemini astronauts spent almost 2,000 man-hours in space, traveling 17 million miles. These men, by their dedication, skill, and hard work, helped develop the techniques which will enable the nation to reach its goal of landing American astronauts on the moon. But before man attempts to land on the moon, additional information about the unknowns that await him must be gathered by unmanned spacecraft. Of the many unmanned spacecraft launched by Kennedy's Space Center teams, perhaps the most dramatically successful was Surveyor 1. Developed for NASA by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Surveyor was designed to soft land on the moon and return photos of the surface to Earth. On May 30th, the Atlas Centaur, managed by Lewis Research Center, boosted Surveyor 1 on a perfect trajectory to the moon. On command from Earth, Surveyor made one mid-course maneuver. The anxiety of controlling a spacecraft approaching the moon was reflected on the faces of the Surveyor team at JPL.
400 feet per second vertical velocity, 28,000 feet. 425 feet per second. 24,000 feet. Engineering commutator 3 has been turned on. We are in lock with the engineering 3 data. Strain gauges are reading out. These strain gauges will give us indication about touchdown. 400 feet per second. 400 feet per second. 12,000 feet. 12,000 feet. All signals are normal. 8,000 feet. 250 feet per second. 8,000 feet. 200 feet per second.
That looks good.
Surveyors reported in excellent condition. All signals look good. 1,000 foot mark. 800 feet per second. 600 feet. 400 feet. 200 feet.
100 feet per second.
100 feet.
100 feet. 100 feet. 13 foot per second.
13 feet per second speed.
Touchdown.
Touch. The bus chief reports touchdown.
Touchdown. Touchdown.
Surveyor landed on the moon after a 63-hour journey, and within another hour began sending excellent photos of the lunar surface to Earth. To the surprise of its designers, after functioning perfectly throughout June, the spacecraft survived the extremely cold lunar night and transmitted more photos in July. In all, 11,150 photos were received from Surveyor 1. Another moon photo program, managed by the Langley Research Center, is Lunar Orbiter. 2 of these spacecraft, designed to take lunar photos from above the moon's surface, were launched during 1966 by Atlas Agena rockets. Both lunar orbiters were placed into elliptical orbits of the moon. At times, the satellites flew as close as 28 miles above the surface to photograph selected areas. The photographs and other information returned by lunar orbiters and surveyors will help select landing sites on the moon for astronauts. To measure temperatures and pressures in space and the composition of Earth's atmosphere, 2 satellites, Explorer 32 and 33, were launched by thrust-augmented Delta rockets. Explorer and other programs of Goddard Space Flight Center provide vital information about the environment of space. Pioneer 7, a miniature physics laboratory, was placed into a deep space orbit around the sun. Pioneer sends back information from millions of miles in space about radiation, magnetic fields, and solar storms. More data concerning solar and space phenomena is returned by observatory satellites. 3 of these heavier satellites were orbited in 1966. 1 conducted near-Earth space environment studies. Others, orbiting above the obscuring effects of the Earth's atmosphere, provided scientists a clear view of the sun and stars. The most significant advance in weather forecasting since the invention of the barometer over 3 centuries ago is the weather satellite. 2 weather satellites launched by NASA for the Environmental Science Service Administration inaugurated the first operational weather satellite system. The orbiting weathermen photograph the cloud formations covering the Earth each day. The ESA satellites relay these photos to weather stations around the world and help forecasters to predict more accurately their local weather several days in advance. While NASA's manned and unmanned launches were conducted at Cape Kennedy during the year, the new facilities of the NASA spaceport on adjacent Merritt Island were declared operational. This is Complex 39 of the Kennedy Space Center, where the Apollo Saturn V lunar rockets will be launched. To test the completed facilities and train launch crews, a mock Apollo Saturn V was assembled. This is the 138-foot-long first stage of the rocket. It was taken into the vehicle assembly building, where two upper stages were undergoing inspection in test stands. A 44-story high mobile launcher was moved into one of the high bays of the building to serve as the assembly platform for the Saturn V. Assembly of the huge vehicle was carried on for several months. This work, plus exhaustive tests conducted later at the launch pad, provided invaluable training for the ground crews. A mock Apollo spacecraft was mated with the Saturn V. This was topped by the launch escape system, completing the assembly of a 365-foot-high vehicle. On May 25th, a brief ceremony preceded the rollout of the rocket. Space agency officials, invited guests, and Space Center employees looked on as the Apollo Saturn V emerged through the 456-foot-high doorway. This was the first time the public had seen a 365-foot-tall rocket. The towering cargo was carried towards the pad by a 6 million-pound transporter. Powered by diesel-electric engines, it can lift, carry, and balance the 12 million-pound load. The most critical part of the trip was the 5-degree climb to the top of the launch pad. The transporter's hydraulic leveling system balanced the launcher and rocket as it moved up the slope. The mock Apollo Saturn V remained on the launch pad during the summer. The vehicle made possible tests of equipment at the launch pad, including the liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen fueling systems. The tests were monitored in the Launch Control Center adjacent to the vehicle assembly building. This is one of the firing rooms in the control center. These instruments and consoles will be used to control the assembly, pre-launch preparations, countdown, and launch of the Apollo Saturn V. Unlike earlier launch control centers, the launch team has a picture window view of the pads at Complex 39. The mobile service structure was also tested. This tower is used for final pre-launch servicing, weighs over 9 million pounds, and is 400 feet high. The transporter moved the service structure into place on the launch pad. Its circular platforms encompass the Apollo Saturn V, allowing technicians access to the vehicle. While testing and training activities continued, preparations were begun in the vehicle assembly building for the erection of the first Apollo Saturn V flight vehicle. These stages were delivered to the spaceport for assembly in late 1966. This first Apollo Saturn V, the largest rocket yet built by the United States, will be launched soon. The assembly activities gave thousands of visitors to the Space Center a glimpse into the future of heavy launch vehicles. The public may drive through the Space Center on Sundays. Escorted bus tours are available every day. These tours were inaugurated in July to accommodate students and the public. The tours include a visit to the vehicle assembly building and a stop at the launch site from which the Apollo Saturn V rocket will someday begin its journey to the moon. In the industrial area, visitors see the headquarters building, from which Dr. Kurt Debus and his staff direct activities at the Space Center. Other facilities in this area include the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, spacecraft testing facilities, and the astronaut training facility. Tour buses cross the Banana River to Cape Kennedy, where visitors see the launch facilities for past and present space missions. Attracting over 500,000 visitors in 1966, the Kennedy Space Center has emerged as a mecca of international interest. Spaceport tours attract people of all ages and from all walks of life. In September, President Lyndon B. Johnson and Ludwig Erhard, then Chancellor of the Republic of West Germany, toured the center. Inside the Vehicle Assembly Building, President Johnson addressed Space Center employees. The President's words had a deep meaning for all the men and women engaged in our nation's space effort.
The story of man's advancement throughout history has been the story of his victories over the forces of nature. In that continuing story, our own generation has been given the opportunity to write the grandest chapter of them all. So let us go about the business of mankind, and let us meet together in peace the common challenges that confront all men. The time we have is short. The earth moves on, and the heavens wait.